Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts. Here's Daniel's prompt.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So I was looking the other day at some of the very interesting new models that are coming out of China for agentic AI, specifically from companies like, or models I should say actually, like Kimi, Qwen, Minimax, Xiaomi, etc. And these are interesting, and they're often offered, as we've discussed previously, at a very significant cost discount compared to the Western models. But I think that what a lot of people are more interested in, there is certainly a cost incentive. AI can get very, very expensive with agentic coding stuff because you're just sending so much tokens to it. I don't think anyone involved in AI code generation needs reminding of that fact. So they're tempting for that reason, but they're only tempting really if they're any good. And the question of when you see all these kind of glamorous new models coming out, they're all promising that they're going to be, totally fantastic at agentic use. The first question is, well, how do we know they're any good? And the traditional answer to that is benchmarking. Benchmarking, I was looking specifically at SWE-bench, Software Engineer Bench, which is probably the best known benchmark for problem solving. And it was interesting. It was interesting to see that even within that, they had to have a validation subset because there was, from what I understood at least, it's not always benchmarks, put it like this, can be gamed. And there's a lot of caution around those who are aggregating these benchmarks that are going to be taken seriously in the industry, that the data points they're aggregating are validated and fair. This open SWE-bench is one of the best known benchmarks, but if you go searching for benchmarks for just about any topic in AI, you're going to see a surprising amount of options, which always kind of amazes me with AI. You wonder sometimes, how is this ecosystem already so gigantic? Vendors, models, benchmarks, there is a plurality of everything. It's a bit overwhelming. But when we look at the benchmarks that your average person who does, let's say, I'm going to put myself as the average person here, I do see enormous value in keeping track of a benchmark I know to be good, reliable. Yes, it matters. If there's a new model or a slew of new models, I'm going to check this out. And kind of drown out the rest. What would you recommend, not just for agentic, if you're looking at sort of overall instruction following, conversational, what would you point to as the most interesting, most robust benchmarks that people who want to do this may wish to keep an eye on in this year?
Welcome to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem with my brother and resident expert on all things technical.
Herman Poppleberry at your service. It is good to be here, Corn. We have a really fascinating prompt today from our housemate Daniel. He was asking about the state of the art in AI models coming out of China and how we can actually tell if they are any good without falling for the marketing hype or gamed benchmarks.
Yeah. Daniel's voice note really hit on something I have been noticing too. There has been this absolute explosion of models like Kimi, Qwen, and Minimax, and the price point is what really grabs you. Some of these are offering tokens at a fraction of the cost of the big Western models we usually talk about. But as Daniel pointed out, if you are building agentic systems where the AI is actually doing work, you cannot just look at a leaderboard and assume it is going to work for your specific use case.
Exactly. And the timing is perfect because here we are at the start of 2026 and the landscape has shifted so much in just the last 12 months. We are seeing a massive price war in the API market. especially coming out of companies like Alibaba and DeepSeek. But the question of benchmarks is the real thorn in the side of the industry right now. Everyone wants a single number to tell them which model is the smartest, but as we have seen with things like software engineer bench, or SWE-bench,
Right, because if a model has already seen the test questions during its training, it is not really solving a problem. It is just reciting an answer it memorized. It is like a student who found the answer key to the final answer key to the final exam in the recycling bin the night before.
That is exactly the right analogy. Data contamination is a huge issue. If the code problems in a benchmark are public on GitHub, and the model was trained on all of GitHub, of course it is going to perform well. That is why we need to talk about more robust ways to measure these things, especially for instruction following and conversational nuance.
So, let's set the stage a bit. When Daniel mentions models like Kimi or Qwen, what are we actually looking at in 2026? I know Qwen has been a powerhouse lately.
Oh, Qwen is arguably leading the pack for open weights right now. Alibaba Cloud released Qwen 2.5 late last year, and the rumors about Qwen 3 are already circulating. What makes them interesting is their coding and math capabilities. They have consistently punched way above their weight class compared to models that are much larger. Then you have Kimi from Moonshot AI, which really pioneered the long context window. They were talking about 2 million, then 10 million tokens, before LL's aired Angelizo.
And that price difference is not small, right? We are talking about maybe 10% of the cost of something like the latest Claude or GPT models for certain tasks.
In some cases, even less. If you are running an agentic workflow where the AI has to loop 100 times to solve a single ticket, that cost difference is the difference between a viable product and a money pit. But, as Daniel said, cheap is only good if it actually works. If the model fails to follow a negative constraint, like do not use this specific library, or it loses the plot after 5 steps, you are spending more on human oversight than you saved on tokens.
That is the perfect transition into the benchmark problem. Daniel mentioned SWE-bench, which is the gold standard for agentic coding. But what are the alternatives for someone who wants to know if a model is actually good at following complex instructions?
Well, one of the most robust ones that I have been following lately is called IF Eval, or the Instruction Following Evaluation. Most benchmarks look at the content of the answer. Did the model get the math right? Did it explain the concept correctly? IF Eval is different. It looks at whether the model followed strict formatting and constrained instructions. For example, you might tell the model followed strict formatting and constrained instructions. For example, you might tell the model to write a story about a cat, but it must be edits must be the end.
Oh, I see. So it is testing the ability to follow the rules of the prompt, not just the general knowledge.
Exactly. It uses about 500 prompts with very specific verifiable constraints. This is huge for developers because if you are building an app, you need the AI to output in a very specific format, like JSON, or you need it to stay within certain bounds. If a model scores high on IF Eval, it tells you that it is actually listening to you, not just hallucinating a generic response based on its training data.
That seems much harder to game because the constraints can be combined in almost infinite ways. You can't just memorize the answer to every possible combination of word counts and forbidden words.
Precisely. And for the conversational side, we still have to look at the LMSYS chatbot arena. Even in 2026, it remains one of the most trusted sources because it relies on human preference. It is a blind A/B test where users talk to 2 anonymous models and vote on which one is better. Because it is live and dynamic, it is very hard for a company to game it by just training on a static dataset.
I love the arena because it captures the vibes. Sometimes a model is technically correct, but it is just annoying to talk to. It is too wordy or it sounds like a corporate brochure.
Right, and we have seen the Chinese models climbing those ranks. Qwen and DeepSeek have been hovering near the top of the leaderboard, often beating out models that cost 5 times as much. But there is another one I want to mention that addresses Daniel's concern about gaming benchmarks, and that is LiveCodeBench.
LiveCodeBench, is that like SWE-bench but with a twist?
It is. The problem with traditional coding benchmarks is that they use old problems from competitive programming sites. LiveCodeBench specifically pulls problems from contests that happened after the model's cutoff date. It is a continuous benchmark. Every month, they add new problems that did not exist when the model was being trained. If a model still performs well on those, you know it is actually reasoning and not just recalling a solution it saw during its pre-training phase.
That is brilliant. It is like a surprise quiz instead of a scheduled exam.
Exactly. And for 2026, this is going to be the standard. If a model provider cannot show their performance on a dynamic, time-sensitive benchmark, we should be very skeptical.
This is all making a lot of sense, but I think we should take a quick break to hear from our sponsors.
Are you tired of your brain feeling layered like a salmon? Aridomate. Aridomate is the Arini and antiforce kind named Prite. This revolutionary, non-invasive cranial wrap uses bioresonant magnets and a patented blend of essential oils to align your neurons for maximum throughput. Simply strap the brain to turoprinim, Sadits. Side effects may include a temporary scent. You're stoned.
Alright, thanks, Larry. I think I will stick to my coffee for now, but that was something. Anyway, back to the models. Herman, we were talking about how to actually measure these things. One thing Daniel mentioned was the agentic use cases. When we talk about agents, we are talking about the AI actually using tools, right? Browsing the web, writing files, calling APIs.
Yes, tool use is the frontier of 2026, and there is a benchmark for that too, which is much more robust than the old ones. It is called the Berkeley Function Calling Leaderboard, or BFCL. It specifically tests how well a model can take a natural language request and turn it into a perfectly formatted function call.
Like saying, check the weather in Jerusalem and set an alarm for 8 a.m., and the model has to correctly identify the two different tools and the correct parameters for each.
Exactly. And it tests for things like multiple function calls, nested functions, and even how the model handles it when you ask it to do something that it does not have a tool for. Some models will just hallucinate a tool that does not exist, which is a disaster for an agentic system. The Chinese models, especially the newer versions of DeepSeek and Qwen, have been performing exceptionally well on this. In fact, for pure function calling, some of them are now on par with the most expensive models from the big three.
That is a huge deal for developers. If you can get top-tier function calling for a tenth of the price, you are going to switch. But what about the instruction following in a long conversation? Daniel mentioned instruction following specifically. I feel like that is where things often break down. You are 10 messages deep, and the model forgets the initial rules you set.
That is the long context coherence problem. One benchmark that is really interesting for this is the RULER benchmark. It is a more advanced version of the old needle in a haystack test. Instead of just finding one fact and a long document, RULER asks the model to perform complex tasks that require aggregating information from multiple parts of a very long prompt. For example, it might ask for a summary of every time a specific character changed their mind during a 50,000-word transcript.
That sounds much more like real-world work. If I am a lawyer looking through discovery documents or a researcher reading a dozen papers, I do not just need a needle. I need to see the thread.
Right? And this is where Kimi has really made a name for itself. Their ability to maintain instruction following across massive context windows is impressive. But here is the thing that I think Daniel and our listeners should really keep an eye on this year. It is the shift toward multimodal benchmarks. We are not just talking about text anymore.
You mean the model seeing the screen or hearing the voice?
Yes. In 2026, agentic AI is increasingly about looking at a UI and clicking buttons. There is a benchmark called GAIA, the General AI Assistance Benchmark. It is designed to be conceptually simple for a human, but very difficult for an AI. It requires the model to use a variety of tools, browse the web, and reason across different modalities. It is specifically designed to be hard to game because the problems are so open-ended.
So if a model can pass GAIA, it is actually showing some level of general intelligence, or at least very high-level reasoning.
Exactly. It is less about memorizing facts and more about the ability to navigate the world. And interestingly, some of the smaller, highly optimized models are starting to close the gap on these benchmarks. It turns out that you do not necessarily need 1 trillion parameters to be a good assistant if your reasoning capabilities are sharp.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the cost. If I am a developer or even just a curious user, and I see these incredibly low prices for models like Qwen or DeepSeek, should I be worried about privacy or data security? That is often the first question people ask when they see these massive discounts.
It is a valid question, and it is something we have to navigate carefully. Most of these companies offer enterprise versions of their APIs with standard data protection agreements, similar to what you would see with any major cloud provider. However, for a lot of people, the real appeal is that many of these models, like Qwen and DeepSeek, are open weights.
Meaning I can run them on my own hardware?
Exactly, or on a private cloud provider. You can take the Qwen 2.5 coder model, which is phenomenal, and run it on your own server. At that point, the data never leaves your infrastructure. This is a game changer for companies that have strict compliance requirements but want to use the latest AI. You get the intelligence of a top-tier model with the security of a local installation.
That seems like the ultimate way to avoid the benchmark gaming problem too. If you are running it yourself, you can just test it on your own internal data.
That is actually my biggest takeaway for Daniel. The most robust benchmark is your own evaluation set. In 2026, every serious AI developer should have a small hand-curated set of 20 to 50 prompts that represent exactly what they need the model to do. Run those prompts through every new model that comes out. It is called an Evals library.
So instead of trusting a leaderboard, I am building my own personal leaderboard for my specific needs.
Precisely. If your use case is writing Python scripts to analyze financial data, your eval set should be 20 complex financial questions and the expected Python output. If a new model from China or anywhere else comes out and it is 90% cheaper, you run your evals. If it passes, you switch. If it fails, the price doesn't matter.
I love that. It takes the power back from the marketing departments and puts it into the hands of the users. But I wonder, Herman, do you think we are going to see a plateau in these benchmarks? If everyone starts gaming them, do they become useless?
It is a constant arms race. As soon as a benchmark becomes popular, it starts to lose its value because it gets folded into the training data. That is why dynamic benchmarks like Chatbot Arena and LiveCodeBench are so important. But I also think we are moving toward a more holistic view of AI quality. We are looking at latency, we are looking at cost per successful task, and we are looking at the reliability of the output over 1,000 runs.
Reliability is a big one. I have noticed some models are brilliant once, and then fail the next 3 times on the same prompt.
That is the variance problem. In 2026, we are measuring consistency. If a model has a high pass at one rate, meaning it gets the answer right on the first try, that is much more valuable for an agent than a model that eventually gets it right if you give it 10 tries. If you are an agentic system, you want the model to be a reliable worker, not a temperamental genius.
So, to summarize for Daniel's question, if he is looking at these models this year, he should look at IF Eval for instruction following, LiveCodeBench for coding, and the Berkeley Function Calling Leaderboard for agentic tool use, and maybe keep an eye on the GAI benchmark for overall assistant capability.
That is a perfect list. And honestly, do not sleep on Qwen. Alibaba has been pouring resources into it, and their coder-specific models are some of the best I have ever used. They have a version called Qwen 2.5 Coder 32B that is small enough to run on a high-end consumer GPU but performs like a giant. It is really impressive what they have been able to squeeze out of those parameters.
It is amazing to think how far we have come. I remember when we were impressed by a model just being able to write a coherent paragraph. Now we are complaining if it cannot solve a complex software engineering ticket for 5 cents.
We are definitely spoiled by the pace of progress. But that is why it is so fun to track, and I think the competition is good for everyone. Having these high-quality, low-cost models coming out of China is forcing the entire industry to be more efficient. It is not just about who has the biggest cluster of H100s or B200s anymore. It is about who has the smartest architecture and the cleanest data.
Clean data seems to be the theme of the year. If you can't trust the benchmarks because of contaminated data, then the only thing you can trust is a model that was trained on high-quality, synthetic, or carefully curated human data.
Exactly. We're seeing a move away from just scraping the whole internet and toward what we call textbook-quality data. If you train a model on 100 billion tokens of perfect reasoning, it might outperform a model trained on 10 trillion tokens of random internet comments. And that is where a lot of the innovation is happening right now.
Well, this has been a deep dive. I feel like I have a much better handle on why Daniel was so curious about this. It is not just about the cost. It is about the shifting center of gravity in the AI world.
It really is, and for those of us living here in Jerusalem, it is fascinating to see how global this has become. We are sitting here using models built in San Francisco, Beijing, Paris, and London, all from our laptops. It is a wild time to be alive.
It really is. Before we wrap up, Herman, any final thoughts on what to look for in the second half of 2026?
I think we are going to see the rise of specialized agents. Instead of one model that tries to do everything, we will have a swarm of smaller, cheaper models that are each experts in one specific task. One for code review, one for UI design, one for database optimization. And the orchestration of those models will be the next big challenge. The cost advantage of the models Daniel mentioned will make those swarms economically viable for the first time.
A swarm of specialized Qwens and chemists working together. It sounds like a sci-fi novel, but it is basically what we are building right now.
Exactly. The future is agentic, and it is cheaper than you think.
Well, on that note, I think we have covered a lot of ground. Thank you, Daniel, for sending in that prompt. It really pushed us to look at the latest data and see where things are heading this year.
Yes, thanks, Daniel. Always good to have a reason to dive into the latest white papers and leaderboards.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Spotify and at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there for subscribers and a contact form if you want to get in touch or send us a prompt of your own. We would love to hear what you are curious about in the world of AI and beyond.
We really would. There is always something weird and interesting to talk about.
This has been My Weird Prompts. I am Corn.
And I'm Herman Poppleberry.
Thanks for listening, and we will see you in the next one.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.